Some battles don't begin with gunfire, they begin with silence. Arnold Schwarzenegger had stood in war zones, boardrooms, and ballot halls, but nothing prepared him for the moment his phone rang and Gina whispered, "It's Emma." That was all it took. One name, one breath, and the world shifted beneath his feet. What followed wasn't vengeance. It was a reckoning. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun crept gently over Griffith Park, casting soft gold across the dew-kissed grass and winding paths. A breeze rustled through eucalyptus trees, carrying with it the scent of earth, pollen, and something achingly peaceful. Joggers passed each other with nods and earbuds, their footsteps tapping in steady rhythm. Squirrels darted between trash cans and lampposts, and near the main path, a man in his 70s fumbled with his coat pocket, unaware that his wallet had slipped free and fallen onto the pavement behind him. Emma Schwarzenegger saw it first. She slowed her stride, tugged one earbud out, and called gently after the man. "Sir, you dropped this." Her voice was warm, light, and unmistakably kind. She jogged over, picked up the brown leather wallet, and handed it to him with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. The man blinked, surprised, then thanked her with a shaky hand on her shoulder. "You're a good kid," he said. She laughed softly. "My dad would disagree when I leave dishes in the sink." Then she waved, popped her earbud back in, and returned to her run. She was streaming the whole thing live to her small but growing group of followers. A casual caption floated on the screen, "Griffith Sunrise Run." In the corner, a chat box scrolled by messages teasing her about training, about how her dad could probably still outrun her. "He might," she joked into the camera, breath even, "but I look better doing it." Her long brown ponytail swung behind her, and the screen vibrated slightly with each step. She wasn't showy. She never mentioned her last name unless someone asked. To most of her online friends, she was just Emma, smart, chill, slightly sarcastic, a high school senior who liked running, reading sci-fi, and beating her older brothers at Mario Kart. When she reached the clearing by the fountain, she paused to sip water from a collapsible bottle tucked in her sling bag. Behind her, pigeons pecked around a patch of grass. The sun had just cleared the eastern ridge, flooding the walkways in soft amber. She turned the camera toward the cityscape below and said, "Look at that, like LA's not even loud yet." She didn't see Officer Ryan Coulter at first. He had been parked just beyond the tree line, leaning against his cruiser, sipping gas station coffee that had long gone cold. His eyes, lined and unimpressed, locked onto Emma the moment she raised her phone. He didn't recognize her. All he saw was a teenager pointing a camera in a public space, and something about that, about being filmed, tapped the nerve he'd spent years justifying. He walked toward her slowly, hand resting on the loop of his baton. She noticed him just as she paused her stream. She smiled politely. "Good morning, officer." He didn't return it. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice clipped. "Just live streaming my run." "Not filming you," she said, turning her screen to show the paused app. "See, it's facing me." "Turn it off," he said. "ID," she blinked. "Sure," she said carefully, pulling her school ID from the back of her phone case. He snatched it. "You don't look 17. I'm in 12th grade. I go to Westbridge Prep. You can call them." He didn't respond. "Turn around," he said flatly. "What? Turn around, hands behind your back." Her voice cracked. "Why?" "I haven't. Are you resisting?" he snapped, stepping forward. "No, I just..." But he was already on her, grabbing her wrist, yanking her arm behind her back. She cried out as pain shot up through her shoulder. Her phone clattered to the pavement, the screen still blinking. "Stop, you're hurting me. Stop moving," he barked. He forced her face toward the concrete. A couple nearby gasped. One man pulled out his phone and started recording. "She's a kid," someone shouted. "She's just a kid." Coulter didn't care. He pressed his knee into her back. Emma whimpered, trying to breathe. Then came the baton. The first hit struck her thigh. The second crushed into her ribs. The third, harder, unforgiving, landed at the base of her skull. Her body fell still. The world seemed to stop. The man filming shouted. Another woman ran forward, but froze when another officer appeared from behind the cruiser, hand hovering near his holster. "Step back." Emma's fingers twitched once, Blood pooled under her temple, seeping into the cracks in the concrete. The screen of her phone remained open, frozen on the last frame of her smiling face. 10 feet away, a bystander held their phone steady, capturing every moment. They weren't live, but they were recording, and the world would see it soon. The ballroom of the downtown Marriott was filled with applause and the low hum of chatter. Veterans in dress uniforms mingled with students, state officials, and reporters. At the far end of the room stood a podium bearing the seal of California, and behind it, a digital banner that read "Honoring Service, Inspiring Leadership." Arnold Schwarzenegger stood just off stage, reviewing his notes. He was slated to speak last, a keynote about resilience, unity, and what it meant to lead after war. Organizers bustled near him, checking sound levels, adjusting lights. A staff member handed him a microphone. "You're up in 5, sir." He nodded, half smiling, then felt his phone buzz in the breast pocket of his suit. He almost ignored it, but the caller ID stopped him. "Gina," he answered quietly, one step away from the spotlight. Her voice came through sharp and brittle. "Arnold, it's Emma. Something's happened. You need to come now." His breath caught. "What? Where is she?" "County Hospital, Trauma Center. She was attacked in the park." He didn't ask another question, didn't hand back the mic, didn't say goodbye. He simply walked across the stage, down the side steps, through the double doors into the hallway. The MC blinked in confusion. One of the organizers tried to intercept him. "Governor, you're on in," but Arnold had already passed them, his long strides echoing down the corridor like the steady march of something unstoppable. Outside, the city blazed with noon light, but he didn't feel it. Traffic blurred, pedestrians became background. In his mind, there was only one destination: the hospital. When he arrived at County General, the air felt sterile and too bright. Nurses whispered when they saw him. A few stared. One recognized him immediately and pointed toward the ICU without being asked. Gina met him outside the unit. Her face was pale, eyes red. He reached for her. She collapsed into his arms. No words, just shaking. Inside the room, machines beeped softly. Emma lay motionless beneath a white blanket. Her hair, still damp from the morning run, was matted against her temple. A thick bandage wrapped around her head. Her left hand twitched once, involuntarily. Her breathing was mechanical, rhythmic, assisted. Arnold stepped closer, stopping just at the edge of the bed. He looked at her face, at the bruises blooming dark across her cheekbone. One eye swollen shut. Her lips parted just slightly, dry. She looked impossibly small. Like the little girl who used to fall asleep on his chest after watching Pixar movies. The one who asked to help wash his truck even though she couldn't reach the top. The one who never used his last name at school because she wanted to be seen for herself. He placed his hand gently on hers. It was warm. A female doctor in her early 40s entered the room. Her scrubs were wrinkled, and there was a tiredness in her posture that came from too many shifts and not enough miracles. She glanced at Gina, then at Arnold. "We've stabilized her. She suffered cranial trauma, subdural bleeding. We've induced a coma to reduce the pressure. The next 48 hours are critical." Arnold nodded, still staring at his daughter. Her phone. "Confiscated. It's considered evidence now." His jaw tightened. The doctor hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I'm not supposed to say this, but something doesn't add up. Her file, it's been edited. I can't explain how, but I've worked in trauma care for 12 years, and I know what I wrote this morning." That note wasn't there. She glanced at the hallway, then back. "I didn't see anything, but maybe you should." Then she walked out. Arnold remained by the bed, unmoving. The room buzzed around him, monitors, IV pumps, hushed voices. But inside him, everything had gone still. The man who had given speeches to nations, held office, fought wars on screen and off, none of that mattered now. Not in this room, not with his daughter lying broken before him. He leaned down, pressed his lips to her forehead, and whispered one word: "I'm here." The garage was quiet, except for the low hum of the overhead light. Dust motes floated through shafts of sun, sneaking in from the high windows, and the concrete floor held the cool of early evening. Arnold stood alone, still dressed in the same suit he'd worn to the hospital, though the tie was gone and his shirt sleeves rolled back to the forearms. His eyes weren't wet. They were fixed, focused. In the far corner of the garage, past a bench stacked with tools and a rusted-out bike Emma had refused to throw away, sat an old steel cabinet bolted into the wall. It hadn't been touched in years. He walked toward it without hesitation. He reached behind the coats hanging nearby and pressed his thumb to the scanner embedded in the top drawer. The light blinked green. The lock clicked. He opened the door. Inside were files, meticulously labeled, tucked beside a worn leather pouch, an envelope stamped confidential, and a folded canvas duffel that still smelled faintly of fuel and gun oil. He pulled it down slowly, with the care of someone removing a flag from a coffin. Unzipping, it revealed the old olive-green flight jacket he'd worn during his time in the Austrian army, back when he was barely 20, still full of arrogance, muscle, and belief in systems that later betrayed him. The patch was still sewn into the chest, Panzerbataillon 4, his old tank unit. The sleeves were faded, but the weight of it still sat heavy in his hands. He set the jacket aside and pulled out a laminated ID card from the bottom of the bag. Below the official markings was a younger version of himself, hard jawline, shaved head, unsmiling. It was strange, looking into eyes that hadn't yet seen fatherhood. Beneath it all was a small black phone, unmarked, encrypted. Still charged, he powered it on. A single contact flashed on screen, Otis Lang. Arnold pressed call, the line rang once. "Yeah," came the voice on the other end, deep, familiar. "It's me," Arnold said. Otis didn't ask how he'd gotten the number. "I saw the news," he said, voice tightening. "How bad?" "Bad," Arnold replied. "She's in a coma." "Silence, where do we start?" Otis asked. Arnold exhaled, slow. "The officer, name's Ryan Coulter, LAPD. I want everything. Transfers, complaints, buried reports. I want to know who protected him." Give me a few hours," Otis said. "You'll have a full brief." The call ended. Arnold stood still for a moment, then opened the confidential envelope. Inside were scans of training records, old emails, clearance codes he hadn't used in years. As he laid them out across the workbench, he fell into a rhythm he hadn't touched in decades, the kind that bypassed emotion. Every movement was controlled, every breath measured. Hours later, the garage was lit by a single overhead bulb. Papers were spread across the hood of an old Land Rover. Maps, digital printouts, timelines. Arnold sat in a folding chair with a pen in one hand and a laptop open before him. A message pinged. From Otis Lang. Subject, Coulter. Arnold clicked. The dossier unfolded in blocks, assignments, timestamps, internal memos. Coulter had served in 3 precincts over the last 10 years, twice reassigned mid-year. Both moves correlated with civilian complaints. One was from a black high school student. The second, from a nurse in a parking lot altercation. In both cases, no charges were filed, but what caught Arnold's eye was the note in red, record sealed by county-level restriction order. "See Directive 14B. He leaned back. Otis called again. "They buried him," Otis said. "Someone with authority. I found a name, Captain Drew Hastings. He signed off on the transfer, both times, never filed disciplinary action." Arnold stared at the screen. Otis continued. "Coulter's protected, not because he's clean, but because someone needs him on the street, or needs him quiet." "Not anymore," Arnold said. For the first time in hours, he looked toward the old flight jacket hanging by the door. It wasn't just a memory now. It was a signal. The mission had begun, and the system that had tried to disappear Emma's story had just become his target. The office sat tucked above a bakery in Midtown, behind a heavy oak door with no sign. Just a single frosted window that read, "Grace Domings, Attorney at Law." Inside, the space was quiet, humming with low fluorescent lights and the tap of keys on a laptop. Walls were lined with file cabinets, some labeled with masking tape and handwritten years. There were no plaques, no awards on display, just a framed photo of Grace standing beside her former boss, the state's attorney general, during a press conference 5 years ago. Back when she still believed the system worked. Arnold stood at the edge of her desk, arms folded. Grace leaned over a monitor, glasses perched low on her nose. Her hair, streaked with silver, was tied back in a knot that said she didn't care how it looked, only that it stayed out of the way. "You're serious," she said finally, glancing up at him. "She's 17, Arnold replied. Grace nodded, typed a few more keys, and pulled up a database with restricted access. "I still have a backdoor into the old case system. Let's see what we find." Otis stood near the window, watching the street below while keeping an eye on the door. He didn't talk much, but his presence filled the room like a loaded weapon no one had drawn yet. One by one, Grace pulled up the name, Officer Ryan Coulter, and with it came the flood. 3 prior complaints from parents at Fremont High School, 2 from middle school principals, 1 from a janitor at a youth shelter. All filed under the same header, excessive use of force. All resolved with the same line, insufficient evidence to proceed. Grace clicked faster now, face tight. Look at this, all within school zones. Mostly against young Black or Latino students, never escalated to internal affairs. Arnold said nothing, he just stared at the screen. "Here," she added, "there's a school nurse who claimed Coulter shoved a student into a locker during a wellness check. The nurse submitted her own report. It was retracted 2 days later, officially misfiled." Otis turned from the window. "This isn't just bad policing, this is a pattern." Grace nodded. "No bodycam footage ever submitted for any of these incidents. Not once." Arnold stepped forward. "What about unofficial footage, anything online?" She tapped a few keys, opened a social media analytics tool, and filtered posts by location and date. "There's chatter," she said, "but the original accounts were either deleted or locked. Looks like someone's been scrubbing mentions." Arnold narrowed his eyes, too fast for coincidence. That's when the message came in. Grace's secure email pinged with a subject line that read, "From a friend inside." No body text, just a link. She hesitated. "This could be a trap. Or it could be what we are looking for," Arnold said. She clicked. The screen went black for a second, then loaded a shaky video. Grainy, recorded from behind a supply rack in what looked like a police precinct evidence room, time-stamped just 4 days prior. Coulter stood over a workstation, back turned to the camera. In his hand was a bodycam. Another officer leaned in beside him. Coulter plugged the device into a laptop, selected a folder marked Emma-run footage, and dragged a file labeled raw feed into a trash icon. Then, calmly, he opened a clean video editor and began inserting segments of patrol-cam footage, completely unrelated. When he was done, he exported the new version into the department's internal server and deleted the project files. The video ended. The room was dead silent. Otis broke it. They doctored the footage before anyone even asked for it. Grace leaned back slowly. "This is felony-level evidence tampering." Arnold's jaw flexed. His voice was low. "And this is only what they recorded." The screen blinked back to desktop. Grace looked at them both. "This is enough to get someone fired, maybe even indicted." Arnold shook his head. "Not enough, not yet. We're not just after one man. We're after the machine that built him." Outside the window, traffic passed as usual. Horns, footsteps, the rhythm of a city that had no idea what was coming. Inside that office, however, something irreversible had begun. And this time they had the proof. The sky above Griffith Park was a pale, unforgiving blue. The sun had climbed high by late morning, casting hard shadows beneath the trees and stretching the trails with blinding white light. Joggers passed in silence. Dog walkers kept to the grass. People moved differently now. Since the incident, the park had changed. It breathed slower, louder, as if the air remembered what had happened beneath its canopy just days before. And Officer Ryan Coulter was back. He leaned against the side of his cruiser near the East Fountain, sipping coffee, posture casual, like nothing had shifted, like the blood in the dirt had been washed away by the sprinklers and time. He wore his sunglasses low on his nose, scanning passers-by with that same look, half boredom, half warning. His badge gleamed. His weapon belt sat heavy on his waist. He looked untouchable. Arnold walked toward him from across the clearing. He wasn't wearing a suit. No camera crew followed. No press. No entourage. Just jeans, boots, and a plain dark t-shirt. He moved without hurry, without hesitation. His shadow stretched in front of him, long and deliberate. Coulter saw him and smiled, that slow, arrogant kind of grin that people wear when they think they're still in control. "Well, well," he said, pushing off the cruiser. "Look who came to the show. You lost Grandpa." Arnold didn't answer. Coulter took a step forward. "This is an active patrol area. If you've got business, take it to City Hall." Arnold stopped 10 feet away. His voice was low, steady. "You shouldn't be here." Coulter shrugged. "Cleared for duty this morning. Internal Affairs found no wrongdoing, just another misunderstanding." She resisted. "You know how that goes." Something in Arnold's jaw shifted, but he didn't move. "She was 17, he said, 120 pounds. With a phone in her hand, and you say you felt threatened." Coulter's grin widened. "It's all about perception, and I perceive threats very clearly." A crowd had begun to gather, quietly at first, a couple with a stroller. A man jogging who stopped, recognized the scene, pulled out his phone. A teenage girl stood on the path nearby, recording. Coulter glanced at them, then back at Arnold. "You touch me, and it's assault. You so much as blink wrong, and I'll have backup here in 2 minutes." Arnold took one step forward. He didn't raise his voice, didn't clench his fists. "You don't need backup," he said. "You need accountability." Coulter's hand twitched toward his baton. "Last warning." It happened fast. Arnold stepped inside Coulter's stance, redirected his weight with one turn of the shoulder, and swept his leg. Coulter's balance went out from under him. In less than 3 seconds, he was on one knee, face down, his arm bent behind his back in a joint lock so clean it could have come from a military manual. Gasps echoed, phones lifted, shutters clicked. Arnold didn't press harder, he didn't twist, he didn't strike, he held, then spoke. "This," he said, voice cutting through the silence, "is restraint." He let go and stepped back. Coulter scrambled up, face flushed, humiliated, eyes burning. But he didn't move, not with the cameras rolling, not with half the park watching. A young officer appeared on the path, hand hovering near his holster, uncertain. His sergeant behind him recognized Arnold, held up a hand. "Stand down." Arnold turned without another word and walked away. By the time he reached the edge of the park, the video had already been uploaded. By nightfall, it had 12 million views, but something was wrong. News outlets began circulating a shorter version of the clip. It showed Coulter on the ground, Arnold standing over him, but the lead-up was gone. No audio, no context. Just the image of a civilian subduing a uniformed officer. The captions were careful. "Former governor confronts lapped. Tensions flare in Griffith Park. Did Schwarzenegger go too far?" The narrative was shifting. Someone wanted it blurred, but the people who had been there knew the truth. They had seen what the world would try to spin, and they had recorded the whole thing. The room was dark, except for the glow of 2 monitors. Arnold sat at his desk, sleeves rolled, jaw tight, eyes moving back and forth between 2 nearly identical PDFs. One was the official medical report from County General, downloaded that morning through the hospital's patient portal. The other was a scanned copy printed and saved days earlier, before the system had been updated. The differences were subtle, but they were there. In the original, Emma's injury was labeled as blunt force trauma to the skull. Laceration behind the left ear, subdural hemorrhage. Notes from the attending physician emphasized the velocity and direction of the blows. In the newer version, the phrasing had changed. The same injury was now listed as possible pre-existing vascular fragility. A vague mention of seizure history was inserted, marked unverified. There was no mention of force, no mention of impact. Arnold leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, heart steady but cold. This wasn't incompetence, it was erasure. A soft knock at the side entrance pulled him from the screen. He stood, walked to the door, and opened it slowly. A young man stood there, maybe late 20s, Asian American, wearing a plain gray hoodie, backpack slung tight to his shoulder. He looked nervous but focused. "Mr. Schwarzenegger?" he asked. Arnold nodded. "I'm Leo, I was Emma's intake nurse. Trauma floor, first rotation." Arnold stepped aside. Leo entered, pulling a flash drive from his pocket. "I backed up the initial intake logs," Leo said. "Just habit, I do it for all patients." Later, I noticed the file had changed. Someone rewrote the summary. I wasn't supposed to see it, but... He hesitated. She was just a kid. I couldn't pretend it was nothing. Arnold took the drive, set it into the side port of his laptop, and opened the file. It matched the original report word for word, date stamped, time-coded, signed by the attending, unaltered. Leo shifted uncomfortably. They'll know I made a copy, eventually, if they find out I talked to you. You did the right thing, Arnold said, eyes still on the screen. And no one's going to touch you. Leo nodded once, then left the way he came. Arnold stood in silence for a long time after the door clicked shut. Then he turned back to the desk. On one screen, the true report. On the other, the lie. They had tried to rewrite her injuries, shift the blame onto her biology. If she had died, the official cause would have sounded like chance, like genetics, like anything but a baton to the back of the head. That was the line. He picked up the phone and made 3 calls, one to Otis, one to Grace, one to a local civic center with a conference room and a working microphone. By morning, the press had gathered. They weren't told who the speaker would be, just that someone had evidence tied to the Griffith Park incident. Reporters arrived in pairs. Some thought it was another protester. Others guessed it was an activist group. No one expected the door to open and Arnold Schwarzenegger to step onto the small stage alone. He didn't wear a suit, no podium. Just a single table in front of him. On it, a folder marked County Medical. He didn't clear his throat, didn't introduce himself. He held up the folder and said, "This was my daughter's original medical report, and this." He opened the folder and held up a second page. "This is what they replaced it with." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "They took her pain and rewrote it," he continued. "They took their weapon and replaced it with a theory. They altered government records to protect a badge. And if they can do that to the daughter of a former governor, imagine what they've done to the voiceless." Cameras clicked, phones recorded. "You have 72 hours, he said, his voice like steel, to release the full footage, the original files, and every officer involved in the cover-up. Or I release everything I have, to every paper, every platform, every parent in the state." He stepped back, and the silence that followed wasn't passive. It was fear, because the system had just been dared by the one man who didn't bluff. The lights in the ICU never changed. They stayed dim, constant, like the soft hum of the machines that surrounded Emma's bed. Monitors blinked in rhythm. The ventilator pulsed, artificial and steady. Outside, morning light had begun to stretch across the city, but inside this room, time had no weight. It simply passed in silence. Arnold sat in the same chair he had claimed for days. His elbows rested on his knees, a letter unfolded in his hands. It was written in pen, shaky but full of heart, from a girl named Leela in Bakersfield. 14, a student who had never met Emma but had seen her face online, seen the videos, read the headlines. The envelope had arrived with dozens of others, stacked in a box that volunteers had started collecting from across the state. He read aloud, "Dear Emma, I don't know you, but I saw your smile and I cried when I heard what happened. My school had an assembly about you. Our teachers said sometimes the world needs someone brave to wake people up. I hope you wake up, because the world is better with you in it, and because I want to be brave like you someday." Arnold paused, his voice caught in the quiet. He looked at his daughter. Her face was still bruised, but the swelling had eased. Her hair had been gently combed. One hand rested outside the blanket, fingers relaxed, still. He reached over and placed the letter on the small table beside her, next to a drawing someone had sent, a crayon picture of Emma wearing a cape, standing tall beside the words "Hero doesn't need to be loud." He leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You've got a lot of people waiting," he whispered, "but none more than me." Then her finger moved. It was small, barely a twitch, but it was enough. Arnold froze, eyes locked on her hand. He leaned in, watching, waiting. Then came another flicker. Her eyelids fluttered. Her lips parted just slightly. The monitor began to shift, heart rate rising. "Emma," he said, standing now, his hand gently cupping hers. "Baby girl, can you hear me?" Her lips moved again. This time a faint breath followed, a sound, not a word, but not silence either. A nurse stepped in, drawn by the change in rhythm on the screen. Her eyes widened. "Get the doctor," she called over her shoulder. Arnold leaned closer. Emma's eyes opened. Not fully, not steadily, but enough to find the light above her, then drift toward his face. She blinked once, then twice. And then, with effort, her voice barely audible, she whispered, I heard them." Arnold swallowed hard, every muscle still. Her brow furrowed slightly. She whispered again. "Sirens," someone said, "handle it fast." The nurse returned with a doctor. Machines beeped faster now. Hands moved quickly around her, adjusting tubes, checking reflexes, but Arnold never let go of her hand. He didn't need confirmation. She was awake, and she remembered. The system hadn't silenced her, not completely, not yet. The chamber at City Hall was full, not loud, not chaotic, but full in the way that tension fills a room when something real is about to be said. Rows of seats were packed with press, parents, teachers, students, off-duty officers, and city officials. Cameras lined the back wall, red lights blinking. In the front row, Emma sat in a wheelchair, a soft brace around her neck, one hand resting on the folded blanket across her legs. Her eyes were clear. Alert, she said nothing. But her presence said enough. Arnold stood just off stage, holding nothing but a worn white sneaker. He had been invited to speak at the city's emergency council hearing on public safety reform. The mayor had called it. Several state legislators were present. Microphones had been arranged, prepared statements printed. But Arnold didn't bring notes. When he stepped up to the podium, he didn't address the audience right away. He simply set the shoe, Emma's shoe, on the wooden surface before him. It was scuffed at the heel, streaked with dried blood near the toe, one lace still tangled. It stood on its own, silent, small. He looked out at the room. "This," he said, voice low, "was on her foot the morning she went for a run. This is what she wore when she smiled into a camera and waved to an old man she helped on the trail. This is what was left behind when they carried her into an ambulance." "Silence. This isn't about policy," he continued. "This is about people, about the kind of system that teaches fear before it teaches protection. About silence being the standard, about rewriting records before accountability is allowed in the room." He paused, then turned slightly to glance at Emma. "She woke up," he said, "but not every family gets to say that. So while she heals, we work, we push. We remember that every reform is written in names, names like hers." He stepped away, said no more. The crowd rose, no applause, just quiet standing. The mayor moved to the podium but didn't speak. Behind her, a young aide in a black suit approached Arnold discreetly. He handed him a manila folder, no label, just a single paperclip holding it closed. Arnold opened it slowly. Inside were copies of internal memos, emails, a list of officers flagged for misconduct that had been reclassified as training violations. Most of the names he didn't recognize, but two he did. One had cleared Coulter's initial review. The other had altered Emma's hospital report. He closed the folder, looked down at Emma. She was watching him, calm, waiting. He gave her a nod. It wasn't over. Outside, protesters had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice is not a privilege," and she remembered. But inside that hall, something had shifted, not just in law, but in expectation. And the man who had once driven tanks across frozen fields now stood between power and its excuses. This was never vengeance, it was a promise. And he intended to keep it. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.